not recap things, but I thought of a few questions that I thought that may still be out there. Well, I guess I should carry this thing. So a few questions of clarification on the last lecture. Are both the self and selves an illusion from the transpersonal lens? Yes. Last week, we discussed the diversity of how the illusion of self can appear on a spectrum of soul self, which appears to be a postmodern or modern perspective, and multiple selves, which appears to be ancient. And in neuroscience, it's the McGregor mind. There's the neuroscientific explanation for it. Today, we will discuss how both are an illusion that can cause suffering by clinging. So the illusion itself doesn't actually cause the suffering, it's the clinging to the illusion as real. But we'll get into that a little bit. You can't see possibly. How many different illusions? So nobody asked this question necessarily, I just thought of these as good. But how many different illusions are there? What are we talking about? Well, there's many of them, as you can see, but we're going to engage with three in this class in regards to transpersonal psychology. One, the first illusion is the self is part of the universal illusion, but the force behind the illusion is really existing. So examples, simulation theory. So all of the components of self is just part of this illusion that's part of a simulation. But some thing operates the simulation, right? Either probably the last simulation is what would operate this simulation, and then the next simulation. So, right, and then what's his name? The African-American brother that does all the astrology stuff. Anyway, Neil Tyson or whatever this guy was, somebody was talking about the simulation theory stuff and how we either have to be the origin, right, the origin iteration of this, or we have to be the most recent iteration, because because we haven't yet discovered how to do it. So if we had discovered how to do it, then we would either be the origin, or there would already be another iteration of us. And we believe we're the last iteration or the first. So there's that. But anyway, even the first one there's a force behind the creation of even that first simulation. It came from somewhere. And I guess God would be one explanation, but another tradition we have that's not modern scientific theory, or pseudoscientific theory maybe at the moment, but maybe not, is this concept I just thought was interesting, this made in the image of God, in the sense that we are an illusion and there is a creator. In that way, that was maybe interesting, and more other examples you can probably think of. So the issue with this, unfortunately, so the shadow side to this, let's say, if you're into that type of stuff, if you're an ancient Commission or Freudian, this can lead to bypassing accountability. So when I talk about bypassing, it's about the accountability that's being bypassed. Because if it's all a simulation and fake, essentially, then there's no real need for accountability. Could be someone, and they could bypass accountability because things aren't real. And nihilism, in a similar way, they can just disconnect completely from the world because it's not seen as a real experience. And these can be dangerous. So there's that. The self is a singular consciousness, is the second illusion. Yes?
So in terms of the made in the image of God reference, and how to connect that to bypassing, the first thing that comes to mind is people avoiding responsibility for their actions because it's perfect, because God is perfect and they're made in His image, so they can't do anything wrong. Is that how those two can connect?
Yeah, and the practice of that would be going in and, you know, maybe repenting for your sins in the, I'm not in the much of the church, but
Yeah.
in the box, and you do your thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's this, that is a bypassing of accountability of sorts.
Okay.
Would the flip side of it, of also blaming it on the devil, be the same thing? Like when people, like, I've encountered people who have excused their actions by saying, well, that was the devil influencing me. I mean, would that be considered the same thing, or would that be different because that's influence, not image?
Well, it depends on how you, this gets into it depends on how you look at, I mean, you know, the devil and God are two sides of a duality of theory, if you're going to go with that. And in that case, yes, then you could be in the and you could be made in the image of the devil as well. It's because it's both and one and what is it? Both and. Don't, you know, well, there's not even a, well, say whatever you got to say to the world. Yes.
So it says how many different illusions are there? We're going to discuss 3, and it says for number 3 that this one can lead to suffering. So with that, what came to mind for me was, isn't illusion itself a suffering?
Yeah, that's kind of what we're gonna get at. That's what number 3 gets at. And the fact is, but let me just, so the self is a singular consciousness, real quick. I'll just go along, I'll get to that and get to your, and if I don't, then tell me. But the self is a singular consciousness, real quick, is number 2, all right, that we will be addressing. And we addressed that a lot last week, singular versus multiple. And consciousness had a lot to do with that, you know, singular consciousness. So that's one way that things are an illusion, because it's been borne out in neuroscience and in anthropology and through observing the human experience, phenomenology, that the self is not a single consciousness. Even if it's an illusion, which it may or may not be, but to this tradition it is, it's not a single consciousness. That bore out. That wasn't, that doesn't hold water. And we'll talk a little bit more about that this week, maybe. This, I think, gets at what you're getting at. The self is a permanent, unchanging, and not interdependent, and not interdependent, as in it's independent. Suffering results from the clinging to a permanent, unchanging, and independent self. And that is an illusion. So by clinging to the illusion, absolutely, and the illusion itself is suffering, of course, because it's creating suffering, right? So there's no separation. The illusion that the self is permanent and unchanging is suffering. But so is experiencing that illusion.
And so is the self is a singular consciousness, right? So whenever our attention is focused on ourselves.
Yeah, so listen, this one can lead to suffering, doesn't say this one can't. This is just something I wanted to talk about because we're going to be getting to this today. A lot more than this. This was last week. So I just kind of want to move forward. All of these a lot of things, I mean, yes, the illusions, yes, and the illusion itself may have been born out of suffering is kind of the theory as well that I hear you kind of tossing out there. But that's for another day. So that's that, just to clarify last week's, before we move into this week's lecture, last week's lecture. And what time? Okay. Oh, just a couple of fun things to talk about, and this isn't really what we're going to get into today too much. But there's this fellow who did this experiment on readiness potential, and the result was that neural activation of PMC occurs 50 milliseconds before phenomenological awareness of choice. So the implication is that 50 milliseconds before I pick up that pen or even choose to pick up that pen, my body is preparing me to pick up that pen. Right? So essentially it's like this, and my body starts, I'm going to pick up this pen, and then I'm believing that I'm in. So that's one theory that they use to support the simulation theory. Is that our agency comes from that we're conditioned to do everything. So postmodern viewpoints, or modern viewpoints of reality and quantum models of brain functioning may lead to a multidimensional and/or a polypsychic model self. Remember, polypsychic is multiple consciousnesses. So going backwards a bit, a regression of the ego, let's say, maybe. Anyway, so this is interesting. You know about that, but the multidimensional aspect of things is kind of fun as well. And you know, I like to see it as, I mean, I don't think this is the explicit implication here, but I like to see it as like this, the concept of dimensionality and you know, us existing, you know, a sliver of me being right here, existing in a similar space, and this, that, and the third. And how that, if that bears into something, how that how this self here relates to a self in a various dimension, is quite an interesting concept to relationship to maybe we'll be getting into in another 100 years. Ray Kurzweil, who's a bit interesting, has predicted that humans will soon upload their consciousness into machines. I, like many, believe he's already a freaking machine. If you know anything about this guy, I mean, oh my gosh, he makes, what's the guy, the Facebook guy, he makes him look normal and human, normally human, let's say. He has definitely transcended the human body, maybe. So transpersonal psychology has rediscovered ancient methods of transcending the illusion of selfhood.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So the bicameral mind theory, we might have talked about this last week, but what evidence did, what was his name, James, have for that? Like, was it just a theory, or was there some sort of like evidence that?
Oh, so he was a researcher.
Okay.
But not a, you know, like a psychological researcher in that regard. And then so he created a theory.
Okay.
Through observation, and then, through like a text analysis of primary sources.
Okay.
And
things to
this.
Came from.
Yeah, it's a thing, and so he comes with this theory. The theory then bore out in neuroscience, and that's so. His theory was that there was this bicameral mind. He didn't necessarily pinpoint where in the brain it was happening or what was happening neuroscientifically. It just turns out that over time they did these experiments and they found out that his theory, what he was saying was happening, and the vestiges of it, the experiences and the phenomenon, the behaviors that people even had, and the hallucinations, the experiences from his theory were the same as when they stimulated the certain part of the brain.
Got it.
Yeah. But I'm not a neuroscientist, and this is not a neuroscience, just so you know. So that is an amazing, and we used to have one here who taught, so that's a whole different thing, and that's intriguing in itself. Yes. Okay, so the illusion of self, or selves. The Sanskrit for anatman, right, in Buddhism, the doctrine that there is in humans no permanent underlying substance that can be called the soul. The concept of anatta or anatman is a departure from the Hindu belief in Atman, the self. Right? So nothing to transcend, just an illusion, is what anatta is adding to this discussion. And today we'll be discussing a bit about the illusion of self from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, anatta, and we will be discussing hypnosis research and how that bore out the neuroscience of the illusion of self. Why science? The language to motivate clients, because they do not have to believe in anything but the scientific method, and they've been really well conditioned to do that already. So sometimes there will be people you're serving who are hesitant to engage in certain practices as part of your treatment plan, And sometimes you might have a supervisor who might be hesitant, or with whoever's, if you're working under somebody else or whatever it is, or an institutional set of rules that keeps you from, that makes it harder to engage in transpersonal psychological treatments. So, and meditation might be seen as one of those things, even if you're outside of Boulder, let's say, right? So bringing the science behind it is helpful. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but you will have enough information here to be able to go and find neuroscientists and their research and what they've done to be able to verify it to a specific client if you need to. And that's the main point, is that that's why it's being talked about so much. Not because transpersonal psychologists didn't believe in these theories before they were proven neuroscientifically or neuropsychology. So now, delusion of self. The origin of our suffering in life is associated with our tendency to cling to the idea that we have an enduring and unchanging essence, soul, or self. Again, this is the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. The illusion of self as a separate and one of the Tibetan Buddhist perspectives. The illusion of self as a separate and individual self that is permanent and not interdependent. Right? Something's wrong with me. I can't dance. You're attached to an idea of who I am. It's not actually who I am as a non-stable identity or self. So I can't dance. I walk into the dance, or I walk into the dance hall, or there are clubs in Colorado. I'm from New York. There's not even a real club. But you walk into the club and you look around. There's no one there. No, and you look around and the music's playing. Oh yeah, I'm here. Oh, that's right. Anthony can't dance. And you're attached to that, and then you don't dance. And dance is amazing. Anyhow, but that's a simplification. But there you go. And that lack of dancing and that limitation on self creates suffering. So illusion of the material self, projection or matrix, a distortion of our true nature, and belief that it is our true nature is causing suffering. And the clinging, and we will get a bit more into this when we talk about the illusion of the world and how it interacts with the illusion of self. The clinging to the illusion of permanent and non-interdependent self is what leads to suffering, as well as perceiving the illusion of a material self as objectively real. Right? So, to the Tibetan Buddhist, nothing is real because nothing can stay still long enough to be real, is the simple way to say it. Right? So, this is all just, impermanence implies that nothing is real. It appears that way, and every moment I'm reconfiguring, and even to the point where we make up each other, but we'll get to that. I think I put that in another slide. So there's that. The path of meditation is the idea, helps us to see the emptiness or discontinuous nature of our actual experience of self. Now, is meditation the only way to have this, to work, to practice transcending the experience of self? Absolutely not. But it's one that has been found across many traditions and many cultures throughout time. So it's a good one. So real quick, and then we can, we'll do 9 more minutes. We'll take a break. 4 here. So again, Buddhist thought this week. You're at Naropa. So Buddhism stands unique in the history of human thought in denying the existence of such a soul, self, or Atma. According to the teachings of the Buddha, you had this last week, the idea of self is an imaginary, false belief which has no corresponding reality, and it produces harmful thoughts of me, I can't dance, and mine, I own this, selfish desires, right? Well, I don't know what anybody's, but I want that Tesla, whatever it is, right? Cravings, Well, chocolate is really good, but other things aside from chocolate are craving, and gummy bears too. That's okay to the Buddhist. No, but craving for transcendence, right? Craving for cookie, whatever it is. Attachment, hatred, ill will, conceit. I'm not going to give examples. Pride, egoism, and other defilements, impurities, and problems. Kind of like the use of the word impurity sometimes, but. There's that, written in 1959. But what is the thing we're going to extract from that this week, because you saw that last week, is imaginary, existing only in imagination. Imagination, the faculty or action of forming new ideas or images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses. So a dream, or story, or imagination. A narrative we create about what a self is, maybe, even. So, Ayurveda, I believe, states, not Tibetan, I'm Mediterranean, but selfness is said to be the unrivaled door to peace, the terror of evil views, and the sphere of all the Buddhas. Now, what one terms self is entities, nature or essence, which does not depend on anything else. The absence of this, self, is selflessness. So selflessness is offering, again, this prize. You go through the door, ding, 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 you win peace, compassion, and like this crazy wisdom. No, not crazy wisdom. That was a mess. They messed up with that in the 70s or whatever it was out here in Naropa. But wisdom, enlightened wisdom, deep wisdom, not really. Wrong usage, I apologize. That got sloppy. Anyway, door to peace. The terror of evil views and the sphere of all the Buddhas. So, we'll get into second what Buddhas is. Well, let's do it now. Buddhas, enlightened one who has transcended the illusion of self, right? So you will transcend essentially to this is your promise. You'll transcend to the sphere of the Buddhas. We'll talk later in the discussion questions about what you see as transcendence or what happens. This is one theory. You transcend, you go to the sphere of the Buddhas, the awakened ones. Now, what one terms self is entities, nature or essence, which does not depend on anything else. The absence of this self is selflessness. Let's look at a few definitions, and then I'll leave this up, and we can go on break. Buddhas, enlightened one who has transcended the illusion of selves. Unrivaled door, no better door, or maybe no other door, way or path to peace, right? So this unrivaled door to peace, through meditation, whatever, right, is a great prescription. Illusion of self, belief in self as an independent being from the entire universe, alone or singular sense of self. Self, a sense of self that is dependent upon others. There is no independent self, but there is a dependent self. So this would be actually self, let's say. If you want to actually put self without the quotations around it, there it is. The illusion is above it. Interpersonal alienation, sense that we feel separate or alienated from others. Interpersonal alienation, when one feels alienated from other parts of oneself. Loneliness from self, because one sees themselves as singular and not multidimensional or changing. These are forms of suffering. Selflessness, which got brought up as well. And we'll go back to it. It does not mean that you do not have a sense of who you are. We're in this material thing, playing around apparently in somebody's Sims game. And I'm just kidding. Please take care of your children and your cats. This is real, this is very real. It does not mean that you do not have a sense of who you are. It just means that you are not hypnotized, which we'll get into next, by it. And you realize that no one is living out of relationship with every other being and piece of matter that exist in the universe. Not understanding our connection to all beings is the opposite of self. Should have put that there. The antonym. So there you go. Let's put that up to make things even less confusing, and let's take a. Oh yes, the
I was
question.
hoping if you could go back to the definition so I can write down the last one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. And again, the hypnotized by it is, part of that process is this grasping as well that they keep referring to. Yeah. All right.
Hey, you want to get out of that? That one's good.
Yeah, were you, it's like starting.
Yeah, parents won't let me on.
It's all like, yeah.
Where's this necessity?
Okay.
Even that I would like to start with,
Welcome back. We're going to start the second half with a small group discussion on these 3 questions. And I think we can just do it in the but if a group wants to go in the hallway or something, it's a big facility. Until next semester, and it won't be so big next fall when everybody's here all the time. But right now, let's enjoy the spaciousness. Anyhow, so any thoughts you have on a singular versus a more polypsychic view of self? So remember, like a singular consciousness or a multiple consciousnesses. Consciousness I. No. And then a question: what is next in the evolution of self? Before we go into some theories about what is next, I'd like to hear. Well, we heard a little bit about the matrix stuff and putting ourselves into robots and stuff. So that aspect of it, like the physical self, what's next, but also like what's next in terms of the evolution of this illusion and how we interact with this illusion and how we, so whatever you take off of that question. And then I don't want to create a hierarchy, so we're going to pretend with this question. So it's not that there is or isn't a hierarchy. Like that, I don't want the answer to be, well, there's not a hierarchy. Just pretend. Are the ancient people more or less philosophically or personally advanced than postmodern cultures? And part of the reason I ask this question is because I do, taking psychedelics in my PhD program. I took a course on psychedelics and social justice and different things. And, there's a way we seem to view ancestral stuff, knowledge, medicines, even if they're presented as such and they're not. There's a way that we view it. So I'm just curious in people's thoughts about the third question as well. Cool. Let's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 1, 2. Yeah, 3 groups of 3 and 1 group of 2. Is that cool? So we went right to left last time. Let's go left to right. Does your group want to?
I was there last time.
Oh.
Loved it.
But I'm down.
Well, okay. Well, you don't have to talk if you don't.
No, I'll start.
Yeah, you're right.
I think we jumped a little bit all over. I'm personally still wrapping my head around the concept of polypsychic. I feel like I read the definitions, but I'm still not like internalizing them as deeply as I want to. So we were jumping around on that concept, and then the next evolution of self and selves, we were talking about perhaps the brain is developing to, we were throwing around different theories, but the brain is maybe developing to a point where in like 6 generations or something, it'll be more of a norm to be talking about some of the stuff that we talk about now around like energy and psychic connection and collective consciousness, which like if you said that in the middle of New York, you get really weird looks. But and what was the other concepts that we were talking about?
Ourselves.
Yeah.
Just being tapped into each other.
Yeah,
And,
more of a universal love, sort of.
and we have some other big theories we'll get into.
I know, I like
Uh,
that.
Also, we were talking about with like the polypsychic view of selves. I guess like what's the difference between like the multiple consciousnesses or the like just having different aspects of a self. And then we were also talking about like somebody with maybe that experiences like the multiple personalities or something. Like maybe they have, you know, like the same amount of selves as us, but they just don't have like a distinction in their head and they take ours for granted or something. And then, what else?
The ancient example.
Oh, yeah.
We were talking about kind of like,
We think they were definitely
That's
transpersonally
yeah.
more advanced. Because a lot of their lives were like, their spirituality wasn't really separate from their everyday life. Like, their experience with the cosmos was just like all one big reality, and they didn't, or in some cultures anyways.
right, it wasn't like religion was separated.
Yeah.
No.
It's like you pray to the god and you plant this and this is the way it will be. So we felt like they were really transpersonally connected.
So real quick, because it does seem like, so yeah, aspects of self and multiple consciousness are can be the same thing. Because it's just about the lens of your awareness is coming from, kind of. So, but yeah, great, thank you. Group left. Next left. The next group.
More different left.
Oh, it's you two,
Yes. Well, I think I'll just start off by saying we also sort of took this conversation more so talking about consciousness itself. I think we also kind of like jumped around a little bit and sort of like talking about like our own personal theories on like a singular consciousness versus like a bunch of different ones. And what did we add into that?
I mean, like Jessica was saying, we spoke more on like the polypsychic version of consciousness, and just we talked about like one, it's like I don't understand how there could be multiple forms of consciousness, like unless you're talking about two, you know, there's the conscious and then there's the unconscious. So I don't know what it means necessarily, like what makes something multiple. I guess that's something to consider. But I don't know why, I've never heard of other than the conscious and the unconscious, and why we would need necessarily more versions of consciousness. There's so much to explore within ourselves. And I brought up you know, the whole idea of going to space. You know, that's nice and whatnot, but it's like there's so much to explore down here, you know, and that's how I feel like comparing that to like multiple versions of consciousness. Like it's like going to space, I guess. If that makes any sense. Probably does.
Yeah, and real quick, because you kind of implied a question, that, you know, you're right, there's no need to have this sense of polypsychic view of self unless someone has asserted, or a culture, a tradition, or a whole people have asserted that there's a soul consciousness, right? So once that discussion started happening, as we talked about, maybe in 1200 BC potentially, that's when it became required to actually mention that there's a polypsychic perspective, or you know, view. So it's not that there's one or many, it's just the way that people are perceiving it, is what it is. There's none actually, but according to the, you know, this illusion, but even the many aspects of self, you know, come together as a sense of self, right? It's just about acknowledging the various forms of consciousness as versus one soul consciousness. So
I want to add something here that I just sort of thought of. because I mean, we're talking about the ever-changing nature of the self and of the
Yeah.
reality around
All
us
of
too,
it.
right? So I'm thinking like, what if there aren't multiple, you know, selves, versions of ourselves, but instead, like, and maybe this is in alignment with what we're learning here. Well, it's an illusion, is what we're learning here. But it's an illusion because it's ever changing. So maybe that self is like sees different, let's say, called chapters of Jessica, right? Like who I am is constantly changing, and so it's not multiple of me. It is like this thing that is constantly ebbing and flowing and changing with experience and love and what other like energetic forces of life that I get to experience.
So are you saying that that thing that is changing, that's constantly changing, are you saying that that is you or that's not you?
See, this but I think here both, like I'm saying it's not because the self is an illusion. However, like for the sake of us, like to be a proponent, like the singular versus polypsychic view, yes, that would be me. But then, see, I'm like circling here.
See, like Anthony said at the very beginning of class today, he said that nothing is not an illusion because nothing can sit still long enough for them to notice even if it is real. Because
That's a Buddhist perspective.
from a Buddhist perspective, as well as a yogic perspective as well.
Yes. Similar tradition, similar spaces.
So no, that is not me.
Well, so again, we had this, and I want to get, but there's this sense of Jessica,
Right.
right? So like maybe adding that to the discussion gives terminology for this. And then you both kind of brought up something that I did want to, that should have been a disclaimer for this entire university, but definitely for this class, which is like, well, maybe not for the university, but for stuff, you know, we're discussing, and it came up last week too, like we're discussing things that are really challenging to discuss from within a duality, to be honest with you. You know, because we're discussing things that seem to transcend that framework. Well, let me stay away from duality. It's challenging to discuss these things. We're not conditioned. It's not part of our experience in society to be discussing these things. We're not growing up we're not embedded in a culture that has us philosophizing about self very often. So yeah, thank you for giving it a try and doing a really good job, all of you. So, all right, next group.
Nobody's sure.
Morgan's gonna start us off.
I guess like the thing that we mainly focused on was like the evolution of self, and we talked a lot about the uploading of consciousness and what consciousness really is, and whether or not it's like memories or tangible things, or like what makes consciousness. Now it's on you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, that question like tied into the last question a little bit. Looking at what consciousness is and maybe what it was, and talking about in the Dzogchen readings, it talks about, I can't remember the name of it. It's like Kashni, Nashmi. But it's that categorization of different things. You remember reading with us where we break things apart in order to like identify them, and so we can communicate them and build whatever we have built, and like that has allowed us to create the world as we know it today. But by doing so, we've lost like the connection to the things that we have because we're identifying all these different things, including ourselves, with those things in a very different way than they did in the ancient times, to where like, you know, Devin talks about like ayahuasca and how like they knew to use this certain plant, this like flower, and like it's like the plants told us. And like I think that, you know, it's kind of with the core, like so again, it's like this teachings are in us, but the way that we view the world and the way that we live within society has separated us from those teachings. And so like coming back home maybe to that, right? Kind of like we talked about it in like with this natural progression of human life. When you're a baby, you have that natural connection. Then you identify with like this human part, and then you can move back into transcending that, reconnecting with the universe. So I think that was kind of like the main part of our topic, besides just like what the fuck is consciousness? Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Well, and can we upload it into the computer?
I'm spending every moment of your existence trying to work on that one. So.
Yeah. Good job.
actually a great movie. It's an older movie, but it's called The Lawnmower Man. And
It's a great.
this scientist takes this lawnmower guy who's kind of like the idiot of the town, and he takes him through this virtual reality training program, and eventually that lawnmower guy, he gets smarter than the scientist. And then eventually he starts displaying psychic abilities. He's able to like hover out of his chair and move objects with his mind. And he goes, oh, that's just a primitive thing. We already have that. And then eventually at the end of the movie, he kind of like infiltrates himself into like the internet, basically. And I don't know, it's just had me thinking about when we're saying consciousness, what are we actually talking about? And what is actually being transferred into, like, say, a new body. Like they're saying in the future we can transfer our consciousness into a new avatar. We can select whatever body we want, but what is actually happening there? Anyway, transpersonally advanced, that term too is like,
I don't get why we have to like make consciousness like this super complex thing, but maybe at the same time, like the reason why we do is because it's like the way that I personally see it is like it's maybe could be limiting, but like isn't, I mean, it's something as simple as like what is consciousness? It's just pure awareness. Like when you are aware that you're, I think you said, like, why do we have to tell ourselves, like, I'm brushing my teeth? Like, why do I have to tell myself I'm brushing my teeth? Remember, you said that, right? So, like, that right there is consciousness.
Right.
It's just, I'm telling myself because I'm training my mind to be, or I'm training the self to be aware that I'm brushing my teeth. Like, that, isn't that literally what consciousness is? It's just pure awareness?
Yeah, I mean, real quick to get to, absolutely, and kind of piggybacking, I think you're only talking about the advancement of the illusion of self. Like the illusion of self will, or with the robot thing, not what you're saying actually, but with Kurzweil is, because it's putting this illusion of self into a machine.
Right.
It's not putting, like, it's not actually transcending self.
Right.
And there's a machine involved or whatever, you know, or and then there's this machine. So that would be an evolution of the illusion of self.
Right.
You know, we haven't talked much about can awareness evolve, right? And what does that look like? It's kind of a question that maybe we should get to next week. You know, separate from. So anyway, yeah, we will. Anyway, last group, or next group, not last.
So
There'll
we
be
had,
another group next.
we had very different conversations, it seems,
Yeah.
than the rest of the group. Yeah. So, like with the first question, we kind of got into self versus like collective. And we talked about how there's kind of suffering on both ends because they both exist. Like you suffer in self, and you also might be causing suffering for others because you're involved with self. But there's also, if you're super involved with self, this sense of naivety and disconnect. But then on the flip side with the collective, if everyone is in the collective, then yes, the idea is there's no suffering because we're all aware of each other, but in reality, that's not how the world works. So there's also suffering in the collective because when you become a part of the collective, you're aware of the suffering of others. So that was the first rabbit hole we went down. Yeah.
Yeah, so we talked about kind of, I guess like based on the idea that maybe ancient peoples were more in touch with like a collective consciousness. We talked about like the benefits of being in a collective consciousness mindset versus an individual and how like they both offer their own benefits, and now being in this like hyper-rational individual place that our culture is largely at, there's a lot of downsides to it, but it allowed us to learn a lot about the world that we live in, and it also allows for a lot of like diversity, because if people are very focused on the individual, then
naturally you're gonna have a lot of different ways of being, which is its own good thing. And we talked about how the evolution of that might look like returning to a more collective mindset, but without relinquishing what has been gained from being in an individual mindset. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah. I think you guys said it all. I mean, the only thing I'd add is just like, we talked a lot about just being sort of, for the second question, just like at sort of a critical juncture point in our, you know, are we going more towards self or selves? We've sort of been in this, you know, path of really only seeing ourselves and becoming further disconnected from the collective, and that has caused suffering of the planet and other people. And you look at COVID and like just further division of people, and so kind of like the scary moment of like, are we going to keep going further into ourselves, an idea of I am separate and special and not seeing that my actions may in fact impact other people? Or will we begin to recognize that it's important to maybe start going back towards a more collectivist view of the world and each other?
Yeah, and just to add to that, like we brought in the idea of like technology, and somehow we talked about the singularity a little bit. But yeah, like this idea that technology is enabling us to be more connected in a lot of ways, but it's like mediated through a means that is like controlled by like evil corporations, basically, that are looking to extract value from people, and how maybe, you know, we have a choice perhaps to go in the direction of that singularity and maybe reach a more collective consciousness, but at what cost? Or, you know, diverge from that in some way and find perhaps a more organic way to achieve that, or a way to achieve it that still utilizes technology, but without so many middlemen that can muddy the waters, I guess.
And like make us ironically feel more connected, but more like lonely from each other. Like it's all part of the evil game.
Yeah.
So
And then the last part we tacked in towards the end, but then we ran out of time, was also taking into account like how that collective, like we were talking about how mental health and how the conversation around mental health is changing as a society. We're no longer in that conversation of men don't cry, women should be seen and not heard, mental health and therapy is only for people who are damaged. Like that conversation is shifting, which could help with this next evolution. However, it's also really important to take into consideration, like I'm thinking just in America, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, and how there's so many who, how can we reach that point of evolution when we still have, where people don't have shelter, people don't have food, and if these needs aren't being met, how can you even consider reaching this higher consciousness and next step of evolution when you have so many things that are tethering you to self and survival?
Yeah, you all definitely had a different conversation, and you brought up quite a bit of nuance. I guess I have a couple things I'll say before I move on then. Oh my God, is this still set to a different time zone? Okay, yeah, okay. I was like, oh, we need to go. Real quick, all this transcendence is great, but it's free. I just want to put that out there. That's what I was getting at. Transcendence is free. You don't have to pay for it. There's that. Now, singular versus collective transcendence is kind of what you brought up at the end there. And yeah, there's a lot there. But that's a beautiful discussion to have, because it does appear that we're grasping for individual transcendence. You know, even when we're doing this meditation, one of the tools we'll learn about today a little bit, or we did engage with a bit. This is not being promoted initially as a collective meditative experience. There are those things that happen, you know. And there are, in the Hebrew tradition, there's times where prayer is said together at the same time around, even giving into account all the various ways that we engage with time around this world, but at the same time, people are engaging with a meditation of sorts. And there's things that are, but it doesn't appear to include every single being. And if suffering in others and the planet, right, is something that we're going to be considering, then they need to be meditating too, right? So even our tools are human-based, right? And then we've gotten to something else, which is, how the heck do you access stuff in the human space? Well, that's based on all this freaking hierarchy and social stuff, right? So it's like, well, who has access to transcendence then? Is a whole other concept. And is that connected to your karmic journey? No, in my opinion, right? But folks that look at suffering as something that you have to overcome on your own, rather than cessation of suffering being seen as not contributing to the suffering others, splitting those two things and only staying with it's up to the sufferer to overcome suffering is dangerous. And that's why I said no to the last statement. And you brought that up as well, that this is not just about one way to cessate suffering in the Four Noble Truths is to not contribute to further suffering of yourself and others, right? So perpetuating the illusion of self, to get back to transcendence, to transpersonal psychology, perpetuating this illusion of self, right? And capitalizing on it, this is crazy, right? Definitely perpetuate this illusion and contribute to suffering.
I'm just curious, like, how would you approach this with someone who was in survival mode?
Survival mode.
Like, I'm thinking,
Well,
I had like a client last semester who lost his access to food stamps, was going to be evicted at the end of the month, and was unemployed. So it was hard for me to get through to anything with this person because they were just.
I saw your. So real quick, the first thing. Okay, so this is a little story from Buddha that might help or whatever.
Yeah.
Just. And I think someone mentioned it about there's the arrow, right, or whatever it is, right? This arrow, but there's that, which is like you got the arrow in you. Why are you asking me about transcendence? Like get the arrow out of your ass. So okay, get it. But there's also this thing of like this person was starving, essentially, and starving themselves. Let's say, not in the moment of your client, but starving themselves, and saying, what's going on here? Why am I not transcending? And Buddha, she looked at this person and says, well, you're not transcending because you're starving. Like you gotta eat. Like you're still here. You're still here in the physical form. Like you need to eat. That's part of the problem. So that's how this thing works. So what you can do is not contribute further to your client's suffering. They're suffering because they're not able to meet needs, the basic needs, and there's complex reasons for that. So in that moment, they still have the right to access transpersonal psychological treatments. However, there's no however. It ought to be, it's more work on your part, but it ought to be very strategic and specific, and matched with resources if possible. And that's something that you're not working in social services. Per se, you may be, actually, but that's not necessarily what you're doing here. But you do care about people, right? So maybe you are.
Yeah, at times I did feel like I was sitting in the seat of social worker in our sessions instead of therapist.
And you might have more leniency, actually, to help, weirdly enough, than the social service people, depending on what institution you're working for, and definitely if you're working for a private. And then a final thing, meditation, what we're going to talk about today, is a very simple transpersonal practice to share with your clients, and I don't give a damn if you're starving or not, meditation is helpful. So that's something that just, being able to, and maybe even more so, if you're suffering in the physical needs way. But yes, getting into the philosophical aspect of delusion of self and so forth, and but there's no need to, because it's not. I'm not teaching you. You might learn it in other classes. Like, I'm not teaching you that it's the sufferer's responsibility to overcome suffering. Solely that. That's not how it works, right?
But isn't it? I mean, essentially, it is, right? Like,
yeah, but it's not solely that. Solely that. So,
I mean, I guess I don't want to. I mean.
Well, this is the way that I'm trying to change the paradigm of how certain traditions are looking at things in the West, because we're in the West now, and we've been here for a little while. So, and so what I mean by solely is, ask your question again.
I'm sorry?
Ask your question again.
Ask my question?
Yeah, or your concern again. Share with me.
About someone who is suffering, that they are responsible for their own suffering? Or
To transcending the suffering by transcending illusion of self.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's that. But that someone, so let's take it away from the illusion of self for a second. That someone is suffering, and this is again from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, that this is the foundation of the school you're at. Someone's suffering, so they must now do these things, follow the Noble Eightfold Path, right? That's what the prescription is. They must follow this path. Mm-hmm. And then that will lead to them not suffering any longer. Part of that is also acknowledging that the self that appears to be suffering, stop clinging to that self, and you'll no longer be suffering. That's your responsibility. Okay, but it's not solely your responsibility, is what I'm saying. So in addition to what we're learning about here, which is working on the cessation of suffering, doing it ourselves, working on overcoming that illusion ourselves, I am adding to that it is also our obligation, our responsibility, to cessate or to not contribute to the suffering of others. That's all. So it's not one or the other, it's absolutely both. And if you see not contributing to the suffering of others as the same as cessating from suffering of self, then fine. I'm not against that either. But I do not want us to exclude impact that we have on the suffering of others by perpetuating the illusion of self, or within the illusion of self, actually hurting people. Right? Good, I'm glad we had this discussion. Oh, that's not the... Oh, is... So we've talked about this, but this is why there's evidence from the earliest times in civilization that our ancestors struggled with questions about whether the sense of identity or self that we experience was singular or plural in nature, eternal or transitory, or perhaps a mere illusion, or a distortion of our true nature. So we've pretty much gone over most of those things.
No, but besides before 1200 BCE.
No. They could still have struggled with the question, as I pointed out in the last class, that this is all based on us believing the historical record. So now we're going to act like we don't necessarily have to believe the historical record, and that there just wasn't a language spoken around it, not like a language, like a dialect, but there wasn't language spoken around the self-reflection. It doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. It's just, we can't find it anymore, probably because a lot of shit from before 1200 BC got destroyed, to be honest with you. And that's why the statement was about the historical record in the last slide, the last class. But no, we are not going to believe until we have evidence that our ancestors were unable to do everything that we're able to do, because I just said earlier that we're built with the tools to do all of this, and we didn't evolve into being built with the tools. We always had the tools. so this is an interesting thing, and now we're going to get kind of into hypnosis, and switch up a little bit. Again, hypnosis is, why are we talking about it? Because it's like the root of this academic tradition. Okay? And it's like totally about the illusion of self and the illusion of the world that came up in those experiences and in observations around us. So, that's why we talk about it. So questions about the nature of human identity was singular, plural, or both. Were also immediately present in the early history of hypnosis. So hypnosis was getting at this singular or plural. So we'll discuss that briefly. Farion, 1819, used hypnosis in a clinical setting to help people. He called it lucid sleep. Transformation from waking state to sleepy state, yet maintained lucidity. In trance, which is the name for that state, the blending of those states, he discovered polypsychic in people. Other selves showed up to the party. This is where we saw it in clinical psychology. We saw examples of that. What we were seeing in the ancient Cometians, the ancient Kemetic people, the Egyptians, this polypsychic expression. We're seeing it now in the historical record. We're seeing it in the clinical setting. We'll believe it eventually. No, I'm just kidding. So lucidity, expressed clearly, easy to understand, right? So sleeping implies not awake, which implies not conscious, but we'll get to that, right? So sleeping, but lucid. So then I called it blended theory because it seems to be a blended theory that I believe, but I believe it's the sense that, Hilgard was a psychology professor who proposed this neo-dissociation, and it proposes that we have polypsychic identity governed by a central executive ego done through research. So through psychological research, he was able to identify, and we'll go into him in a moment, or the findings, he was able to identify these multiple identities of self that appear to be governed by a central executive ego. The central executive ego is really annoying to understand, but it is what it is. It's the part of the ego that is responsible for calling forth the aspect of consciousness or awareness necessary in any given moment of expression or existing. Your group, I think, talked about you talked about this term that had to do with identifying or how we label things.
Yeah, kanshi, napshi, or something like that.
So like this is kind of similar to that in the sense that like not labeling, but it's how we label what aspect of our awareness is going to be present at any given moment in time. It's like the
Kunsi namshi, sorry.
Yeah, there's like a computer way for that. It's like the well, that's the way that I can explain it right now. So it comes up again later if you're confused, but there's that. So it's like the control switch.
An identifier in computer.
Yeah.
Programming, it's like ID equals. Is that what you're talking about? Programming?
Yeah. Which I think I'm talking about. Exactly. Yes. So there's that. So this is kind of a blending now of the multiple and the singular. So there is the singular aspect of things, but it's dealing with multiple aspects. But there is a centralized thing to this. So ego, again, just because is experienced as the self or I, and is in contact with the external world through perception. So we just talked about this fellow here, Hilgard, and neo-dissociation and anatta. So let's talk about it, right, in this illusion. So real quick here, again, researcher, right? Through research is what we're talking now. The hidden observer experiments. He discovered in highly hypnotizable subjects during dissociative tasks such as hypnotic deafness and hypnotic pain and analgesia. So the hidden observer is this, and I was going to play a clip, but I can't actually access it here. essentially, well, here we go. If queried, some subjects could nevertheless give realistic accounts of the disassociated experience as if a hidden observer was present within the person. So, essentially, one story that was related to me very quickly, so I'll try to recall it. Hilgard was doing the hypnosis experiment and is like we're in psychology class, just messing around, and he's like, well, who wants to do this? Somebody who, let's say you were really good at hypnotism, or you've done it a lot as a participant, you came up, you're sitting here, I'm like hypnotizing you, voila, you're down. He's a little easier than that, and at different times they're talking about different things, through hypnosis. Hypnosis. So he brings the person into hypnotic deafness, so they're unable to hear, and they're stuck just in their world, in their mind, and this particular person was a mathematician. So when he would get in these states, he would just do complex mathematical equations in his head because there was no sound, so he could be all spaciousness. Hypnotic pain is actually easier to manage than the deafness, actually. So, like 70-something% of people, or whatever it is, respond very well to hypnotism in regards to physical pain or emotional pain, which is why this can be a transpersonal treatment option potentially in certain settings with certain people. But like back pain, for example, you can help. You get. Okay, so they're sitting there. He brings the person to deafness, which is quite challenging. A student comes up. Everybody's asking questions. They're like throwing things, or like not throw, but like banging pans, trying to scare him. I think if I'm not mistaken, Hilgard, if anybody knows the story, even shot off a pistol, and the person didn't move, flinch at all, so they believed it. And a student came up and made a request of sorts and said something to the extent of, hey, what if I asked you to raise your hand? Or put a suggestion in the mind of the participant. And the participant raised his hand and then shot awake, something to this extent from the hypnosis, and was terrified, looked at terror, and was terrified and looked at Hilgard and was like, something strange, something different happened. And he's like, what happened? He's like, something foreign raised my arm. And he was like, it wasn't me. And he's like, and I don't remember, and I don't know why. And then the Hilgard was like, well, you were asked to raise your arm. And he goes, I don't remember being asked to raise my arm. And this is where he looked at, well, there's this hidden observer that's there, that heard that and controlled this person raising the arm. And this is part of how they start to believe in this multiple consciousness. So one awareness was deaf. One awareness was not deaf and was able to actually contribute to movement in the physical world, right? So anyway, there's that. There's the clip.
Would it be considered the hidden observer? Like, for example, I was doing my transpersonal practice the other day, and I was doing it for about, I think, over 45 minutes, and I started getting these thoughts, like in the midst of doing my practice, and it's happened to me before. But I start to actually verbalize and respond to these thoughts. Like I'm articulating these words, and I'm speaking in sentences. And then once I notice that I'm speaking out loud, I'm like, oh shit, what am I doing? And then I'll stop. Would that be a part of that?
An aspect of it, but that doesn't appear so hidden. So you're interacting with that. That seems similar to like medium work, is what it sounds like you're talking about. So connecting with an aspect or remnants of yourself, maybe, or of something, and communicating with it, or some essence that's left over in this realm, or however the parapsychologist would look at that. But you are highly aware of it, which is a little bit unique, which is different than this. Or you, like Michael Jordan, can jump really high and I can't. Maybe you can see the hidden observer and other people can. So there's aspects of things, like we all have different levels of ability to it.
But I don't think I'm aware of it. because if I was aware of it, I think there's a point where I eventually do become aware of it, but if I was aware of it right from the start, I don't think I would have been like speaking in sentences. Does that make it? I don't know.
Could that be the same as like having sunglasses on your head though? And like looking everywhere with your sunglasses, and then all of a sudden you realize your sunglasses on your head, like, oh shit, like this stimulation has been here the entire time. Like I've had this stimulus, but I didn't recognize it in my consciousness, and now I do. And so with that, I can take over. You see what I'm saying? I know
So,
it's like, it seems like kind of.
If you're querying yourself, right, so let's look at this statement here for this. If queried, some subjects could nevertheless give a realistic account of the dissociative experience as if a hidden observer was present within the person. So then they would say something like, what this sounds like though, when it really happens is, no, there was someone there, and they controlled this. You know, and they can give an experience like, no, I raised my hand, and I don't know why. Like that didn't happen. Like, I'm aware that I did this, but I'm not aware that I contributed to that gesture. Similar, well, this is why this is one of the vestiges of that brain state that we talked about as well. It seems like an outer influence is contributing, an outer consciousness. This feels like an outer consciousness is contributing. And that's where it might be similar to what you're talking about. That you're feeling that there's some outer consciousness. Now that outer consciousness is still, the next wise we'll get is maybe still within the mind or imagination. But yes?
I guess that would just makes me think about like the default mode network and like how that goes offline when you're in cognitive processing and like.
You're always a step ahead of the slides.
All right, then go ahead.
It might not be. Here, we're going to get there in a second. No, okay, you're right. So go on, because we might not get there today. But yes, that's exact. So, well, real quick then. When they do the neuroscience aspect of things, like your brain is giving off the similar signals in hypnosis and in that state, as well as in what other state? A meditative state. So that's why, and that's the state that they suggest that this illusion of self comes from, and therefore that's the state that you can work with dissolving it maybe. And one of the tools is the meditation.
Didn't they find like that was the difference between things like EMDR and hypnosis? Was hypnosis is like a deeply relaxed state with the neuroscience side of it at least, or where your brain's at, whereas with EMDR your brain's in a very activated state.
Yeah. Yep. The relaxed, the taskless state seems to be the state to work with for manifestation of mental healthiness and manifesting the embodiment of the illusion of self. Because that's where the illusion of self was solidified apparently. But we'll get to that next week, because in the next half hour we're not going to have enough time to get there. So real quick, just as another take, just to add to it, is the sociocognitives. So their take on disassociation and the illusion of self, or Nalanda. The hidden observer is not real, right? So it is a role. So in the to these folks, the hidden observer still appears kind of real. To these folks, the observer is not real. It is a role created and enacted by the subject in response to the hypnotic instruction given by the experimenter. In this way, the self is also a role we play. Right? So the self is responding to the hypnotic instruction. And the self itself is creating this hidden observer. The hidden observer is actually an aspect of this polypsychic self, is what they started to think next. Self or identity is constructed, role-governed, and performed as a kind of narrative process in which we come to construct our identity as a believed-in imagining. We imagine it and we believe in it, is the implication of the social cognitives and this way of thinking. So I'll give folks a second. I will also upload the slides, but I do know that when I'm a student, I like to write notes actually as well. So this is a sort of fantasy that we're playing out that requires imagination and belief in that imagination, right? So this gets into manifestation type of thinking. That is really, they're going to have, whatever these jerks, they're going to have a manifestation, one of these clubs. Clubs is another C word for them. Okay, so more recently now, so let's continue this. More recently, Barnier, Cox, Amanda Barnier, Rochelle Cox, and colleagues have shown that people experiencing hypnosis can even have the ability to convincingly transform their identity into that of another person to such a degree that they no longer demonstrate signs of self-recognition. Oh, it's Anthony. When they look in the mirror at their image. Even crazier, love example. Another person, love is even, it's an illusion like self, no. It is as fleeting and impermanent. Okay, so yes, not recognizing self in the mirror, but there's also, they also shown that you might not recognize a friend or a loved one or a diminished or loss of physiological response. So when you see someone you know, we all know each other now, so there will be this certain, oh, well, I hope, or whatever, but there will be a physiological response. People would be in a hypnotic, experiencing hypnosis and not recognize their children. And not just not recognize them, no longer have that physiological response that, there's a word for it, but that's like built into us as beings. This relational sense. So,
as opposed to like somebody with Alzheimer's who forgets that they know somebody and then like maybe reacts with fear. In this circumstance, is it correlated to like experientially not associating any type of experience with that entity?
Yep, like a stranger.
Is this while they're in hypnosis or even after, or both?
Well, I believe, while in hypnosis, my theory would be that there could be vestiges of everything, right. But that would also have a diminishing experience, so it would fade out over time, without access to the experience, the transpersonal phenomena itself of hypnosis. Yes, or the brain activity that occurs. Real quick, I want to say something about the brain activity. There's a medium in the other transpersonal class who was talking about how they physically feel their brain like an energy shifting from one side to the other when they are about to, or they're about to witness an entity or energy. Yes.
So I was just wondering what the implications are for these findings. Like, if a person can be hypnotized to not recognize themselves, what are the implications, I guess, in terms of the nature of the self or whatever else is relevant here?
But the self is an illusion.
Gotcha.
That's what they're trying to. That's what the lecture is getting at.
Gotcha.
Is that this is the way psychoanalytically, but this is the way that we view the self as an illusion. This way. This is how we verify it this way through research.
Gotcha.
Scientific research. And the only reason, again, we're talking about scientific research is because you might have a client who you're totally in a situation where you could bring in a hypnosis, or maybe you are yourself, and they're like, yeah, my back hurts, but like, really, are you kidding me? Or they're like, my heart hurts, but my emotionally I'm hurt, but no, I don't really know. This is some hippy dippy Buddhist shit. Like, are you kidding? And then you can, well, no, actually, there's studies that, and again, I didn't say this, but I wanted to say this. This class is, it's the only transpersonal psychology class I think that the introductory level or whatever it is, we assume you have certain access to things, but this is like a resource, and it's a springboard. So any of the things that you practice on your own, definitely feel free to expand upon them as well after this class, and also any of the information that you find as well, and continue to challenge anything as well. And if you're not, if you're not comfortable speaking up in the moment, then do it via email and I'll bring it back into class as well. As I was telling, I'm not going to remember any of your names, but as I was telling your kids, but as I was telling your colleague here, I do identify as part Hebrew or Jewish, and the wrestling with God phenomenon experience is something that I take into the academic setting as well. We're trying to figure this all out together. That's part of what we're supposed to be doing. We've been sanctioned with at least that right, it seems, to pretend that we know how to think about things. All right, love. Empathy and self. So we'll get into empathy for a second, and then we'll take the last 15 to just talk as a group. Empathy is a bridge between the illusion of self and the other. Is the promotion here? The empathic involvement theory. These mysteries of self is the theory that these mysteries of self can be better understood by a close examination of how empathy and its embodiment in the mind and brain influence hypnosis and the self. So real quick, we'll just empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of an other through transcending the illusion that we are not interdependent and permanent. So the illusion of self. This is also why, to me, suffering is about cessation within self, but also empathy implies that this isn't an isolated journey that we take towards transcendence. The EIT, the empathic involvement theory, proposes that processes of empathy are closely involved with the creation and maintenance of hypnosis and self. And we'll get into that. I should probably save this for next week because it opens up a whole new thing. So let me, so close your eyes while I skip to the questions. Oh, well, here you go. Here's your default mode. Oh, there it is. Here we go. So, we're going to skip a little bit, but I can go back and, but real quick, we might as well. Advanced meditators do show, well, you know what, we'll do that later because we haven't even talked about that. Let's just go to the food for thought. I'm just curious to close out that we do not have enough time. Real quick, time. Someone said time. So in or you were talking about your Jessica being Jessica over time, and how does that interact with a cyclical perspective on time versus a linear perspective on time? Does Jennifer loop around on herself, and does she loop around on herself repeatedly? Oh, Jessica, sorry. I told you I'm not going to remember your name. Does Jessica loop around on herself, or is there a circle, or is it a straight line of Jessica? Right. So there's different ways that we can interact with that. But for now, what occurs when one transcends the illusion of self? You just did it. You became Jennifer. The narrative self, like I am this person. So what occurs when we're able to do that? We'll talk about theories of what they say next week. Yes?
I was going to say that I feel like our sense of self provides a lot of reference points for interpreting the world around us. So one thing that can happen is seeing things in a completely new light.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a very realistic answer too, but we can feel free to throw out theories and things like that as well. or any thoughts, and I'll.
I think that there's a shift towards compassion and understanding, you know, to move beyond the illusion of self. You can see the game that everybody else is caught up in, and through that process of understanding your own relationship to that sense of self that you have now transcended, you can understand the same in the others. And with that comes infinite love and understanding beyond the scope of any judicial system we could be build or creating.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when we talk about the illusion of self in this question, are we talking about it from the Buddhist perspective or the transpersonal perspective? I.e., are we talking about the illusion of self being, the illusion is that the self is actually not real, or the transpersonal of like the self is real? Oh gosh,
Can I actually
oh no.
comment on this, because I think where she's going with this is an important point of like the dangers of this conversation pushes something that I think is more built for self-discovery than it is necessarily built to try to intellectualize. Like, I think by trying to tell people they don't exist, it's a really dangerous paradigm to like push somebody towards, and then like there can also be this like idea of like, why can't I get this? Like, or these other frustrations that come along with it. So I think meditation's amazing, but it also should come along with like a kind of tag that like, hey, especially things like like there's a lot of people that have actually done meditation and like gotten into a worse mindset, you know? And
Yeah.
so
I mean, this seems like the worst thing for like a psychotic person.
at what point though? And that's the thing,
Yeah.
like I think as a future therapist, it's like this could work at a very specific point, but it shouldn't. It should be talked about.
It's real quick. I want to like it's the grasping, and not that this counts with you, but it's the grasping to this illusion that we are going to work with people. We are not in philosophy class with these folks.
Right.
You're serving them in a therapeutic setting. You're counselors. So it's this grasping. So if a client says, well, yours was this, but if a client's like, I'm Anthony and I'm not going to use I'm XYZ and I'm an alcoholic.
Right, you're Jennifer now.
Well, yeah, it's fine. Jennifer. I'm Jennifer and I'm an alcoholic, right? And like, okay, I'm Jennifer, I'm an alcoholic. Well, okay, yes, clearly you are. We've done this integral model of diagnosis that we'll talk about tomorrow. Anyway, but yeah, I've done that. You are an alcoholic. The piss test came back very clearly. That, the breathalyzer, whatever it is, and but you're not permanently an alcoholic.
Sure.
Right.
You are connected to the rest of us, and we love you. And because of that impermanence, you don't need to grasp to Jennifer the alcoholic,
Right.
or grasp to Jennifer not the alcoholic, but don't grasp to Jennifer the alcoholic. Is what yeah.
I'm curious if like in a therapeutic setting, so I had this one client who she struggled with depression, and sometimes in our sessions she would say things like, I've accomplished nothing today, like I'm such a disappointment. And I would then take the kind of motivational interviewing holistic approach of being like, but you did accomplish something today. Like, did you get out of bed? Yes. Did you go to class? Yes. Okay, you did something, you woke up, you didn't do anything. So it was like this, taking this statement of, I'm a failure as a person, I haven't accomplished anything today, to say, hey, sometimes something as simple as making your bed can be the accomplishment of the day if you need. And I took that perspective, and I had her homework was she had to write, every day she had to put in her journal at least one thing that she recognized as here's how I can spin that. So would that be disillusion of self, of this is what she believes, and through exercises and our sessions, shifting that?
Real quick, we're gonna come. I think you just gave her tools for self-hypnosis.
Hey.
Self-hypnosis.
Cool.
But the procedure or the state induced by that procedure, which is what you're getting at, we like for her to feel the state of upliftment, from the procedure of hypnosis, in which suggestion is used to evoke change in sensation. So the suggestion that instead of I didn't do anything today, the suggestion is I did something today. Now you have to do something to say that. No, I'm kidding. But we can't just be tricking ourselves in.
I was like, it can be as simple as sitting up in bed.
No, I'm teasing. But so this is what I think. Yes. So that would definitely be a transpersonal way to engage with your client. That's transpersonal counseling.
Cool.
That's an example of it. Absolutely.
Is this how affirmations
From
work?
the root too. Hmm?
Is this how affirmations work? Like, is it the same idea?
This is the concept that we'll go over next week,
Gotcha.
and that how they absolutely. So it's a form of hypnosis. Now hypnosis is a pretty maybe not the most positive. Or, I don't know. It's like in some scary movies and a person, so it's not perceived well in the media.
Stigmatized.
But and it's true. It's not about this. Self-hypnosis is what really is going to be brought up next week as like a real suggestion on how to work with this illusion of self.
What I'm interested in, just from reading the article that Dr. Wickramaseka wrote, is about how in order to really work with someone with using hypnosis, like they have to be an empath. And I'm just
That's his theory. Yeah.
I'm really
That's his theory.
curious about that, as to okay, if someone's not an empath, I feel like, I don't know, to me.
So to clarify real quick, you heard that the hypnotist has to be an empath, or the person being hypnotized?
The person being hypnotized has to be an empath.
Okay, so therefore the implication would be in order to be able to self-hypnotize, you have to be an empath. And that's just not, either that's not true or everybody's an empath, is my answer to you. Because we all have the tools. It's about being aware of those tools and embodying them, or activating them is another way of looking at it. Or both.
In the hypnosis class, we talked about how it's just and I think the way that Ian put it was there's no definitive way of being this is why we know this person's this way, but it's where some people are more prone to being hypnotized.
Yeah,
we're
highly hypnotizable people
Yes.
are more empathic.
Right.
And I would say that's probably because empathic people might be more suggestible. But that's just my guess.
My thoughts on it were
Yeah.
that they're able to see things from other perspectives, and by doing that, they
Yeah.
understand the ability to change.
Right.
And I think that capability, if you are live in this world of that person's gonna be that way the rest of their life, that's not a very empathetic view of someone else's situation, understanding the components that made them that way in that situation. So by understanding the complexities of what makes up the circumstance, I think that you can become more apt to hypnosis.
An
Yeah, that's a good
exercise
way
we
to
did in
explain
class was 99% of the population could be hypnotized to do the arm lowering exercise. But it's only a third of that percentage could do the arm raising hypno exercise. So.
Well, yes, so, but real quick though, in that moment in time, so
Yeah.
that's ever changing though. So so today in that moment, maybe the person could, the self that showed up that day, let's say, or whatever. But I also like to look at this underlying potential that we all have, and it's the goodness in all of us of this potential. And whether we're aware of it, whether we're activating or embodying it, I believe that we all have the tools. This tradition believes we have the tools. That's the optimism with the transpersonal psychology, is this optimism that we can do this. Or that our clients do, and us too, but our clients. So any other thoughts in the last 5 minutes or so? And then we'll bow out. Or what time is the class end? 6 o'clock. Oh, so we are. Okay. Well, any final thoughts?
I could sit here and bullshit about this all day. This is fun.
I like how we're doing this class. It's not a necessarily final thought of this, but I like the lecture, discuss, combo thing
Yeah.
you've got
In person,
going
it's a
on.
very different, it's a different vibe.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here in person.
Yeah.
Online, it feels much more like, oh, I just have to read it. Just pop stuff into you. whatever interface you have there. All right, awesome. So yeah, we didn't even get through this, which is fine. And again, we only have a few, we do this for a few weeks, and then we start to share some of our exercises with each other because there's a lot of us here. So I'm going to extend that probably an extra week, but I'll update you next week on the investment in the syllabus, the timeline in that way. And let's bow out if you'd like. All right, get home safely, drive slow, carefully.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh.